Uh, Hello and welcome to the Pagir podcast. Usually in the Pagir history series, we speak with academicians, activists, and intellectuals who have worked extensively on Tamil literary, cultural, and socio-political spheres. This is a new series called as Pagir Introductions. We already had one such session last month. Here, we introduced varied socio-political and cultural topics in a shorter manner. We invite guests and they'll speak for about half an hour or so, and then we'll ask questions from it and hope to learn from it. And we are very happy today. We are very happy to have our first young scholar here, first PhD scholar here. Welcome, Tanya. And today we have a very interesting topic on hand. It's about Tawaif culture. It is inspired by the recent foray with Heeramandi. So to introduce the topic and to introduce the guest, we have Arun Prakash Raj.
Yeah. So recently, Sanjay Leela Bhansali's Heeramandi created a significant curiosity among the audiences about Tawaif and courtesan culture. Since the series itself is about Tawaifs in colonial Lahore, and the manner in which the series was picturized was so grand and spectacular, and then the characterization, like how the Tawaifs were shown as the queens of Lahore, very powerful women. So all these elements, it generated a lot of curiosity among us. So today we have a scholar who have worked on Tawaifs. So, and she is Tanya Burman. Tanya Burman, she's a scholar of modern Indian history and feminist methodology. She combines research work around 19th century Awadh with the idea of women's representation, sexuality, space and politics in pre-colonial and colonial contexts. She is currently pursuing her PhD. I mean, she almost like completed it. PhD in history at Ambedkar University, Delhi. She is working, or she worked on Begum Hazrat Mahal. That's what her PhD is about. So today we have Tanya with us because she works on Tawaifs. She is here to initially make her perspective or opinion on Heeramandi series, and through that she will introduce us to the Tawaif and courtesan culture, the history of Tawaifs, and other aspects of the courtesan and Tawaif and courtesan culture today. So, welcome, Tanya. So, I think I think like you can start your presentation. You can like briefly talk, introduce us. Yeah.
Thank you, both of you. Thank you for having me. So I just thought I'll talk about Heeramandi first, and then through that I'd pick up some themes and talk about Tawaif. And so there is, of course, Heeramandi puts forth a very important and significant aspect of history, and that is about the participation of courtesans in various sort of different time periods in which sort of we struggled for independence, or through for anti-colonial against colonial forces. So it's presenting a very important and often sort of forgotten or not talked about aspect of history. So that's great. And even when I was looking for uh, reading around to prepare for this presentation, just if you Google uh, Tawaif for Heeramandi at this point today, you'd find sort of research history questions of, did the wives really participate? Were they actually really so important? So it sparked that interest, and that's like, I'm here for it. That's great. But of course, there are a couple of issues and inaccuracies, and a lot of scholars, particularly working on the courtesan culture in Lahore and Punjab, have talked about. And I'll just sort of briefly talk about a couple of things which would make it which would also relate to larger, broader questions about Tawaif culture as in entirety and so on. And one of the first things is uh, that it completely sort of erases the regional diversity of Tawaif culture in Lahore, and it's situated there. Heeramandi, if you look at the history, originated from this person called Heera Singh Dogra, Heera Singh Ki Mandi, which was an economic hub It was a grains market. The wives also lived there, and he was a prime minister during the reign of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. So it had a lot of Sikh influence, and that should have reflected on, say, the cultural performance, on the lifestyle, on the clothing also of Tawaifs in Heeramandi, which we find missing. Scholars such as Radha Kapuria have also worked on this, and they've shown how Tawaif culture in Lahore and Punjab, in pre-partition Punjab, was very much sort of associated with pilgrimage to shrines, to dargahs, and all of that, and which sort of also gets. And these places were not were more syncretic, right? So that sort of history of secularism or syncretism in Tawaif culture also is missing from the series, which also relates to another point that the wives were patrons of art, architecture. They commissioned schools, they commissioned shrines, and in my area of research, I work on Awadh, which was a successor state of the Delhi sort of Mughal empire. There, particularly, we see that they commissioned Imam Baras, which were unique to Awadh, to the sort of religious cultural space of Awadh. So they were very much involved in all of these other activities, which again we don't see reflected so much in the series. There is also then therefore a broader sort of discussion about the socio-cultural life of Tawaifs beyond the kotha, beyond the mahal, and the politics around it. So you don't see, even within the mahal, for example, you don't see the relationship between tutors and Tawaifs. You don't see what is the structure of patronage, and some of the things are completely inaccurate. For example, the whole stress on Alamzeb's first performance and so on. And so there were elaborate ceremonies which were known as Natutari or Sardhakna and so on, which was sort of symbolic of the initiation of a girl into the Tawaif practice. So even though there's a lot of stress on that moment, it were also very important social cultural events, and they established long-term patronage. And that patronage wasn't just about sexual availability to a particular person or bidding for the first night or whatever. It wasn't like that. It ensured a long-term patronage of one particular sort of noble or royal person towards a young Tawaif, and usually sort of it carried on for a lot of years, 20, 25, 30, as long as either one of them was living. So all of that sort of historical sort of structural aspects are missing in the series. There is also, when we're talking about Alamzeb particularly, there's a lot of, I feel, an overstretch on a division between Tawaif and being a poetess. And the whole sort of character is that she wants to be a poetess and not a Tawaif. And there are scholars who have worked on this as early as, say, 1860s. You find various publications which talk about female poets who were also Tawaifs, right? So it was not so opposite that a Tawaif could not be a poetess or a poetess couldn't be a Tawaif. And that seems to be a more sort of modern take on, it has some sort of moral judgment also, right? So Alamzeb doesn't want to be a Tawaif, she wants to be a poetess, which is somehow presented to be more, superior or, more sort of sophisticated or prestigious than being a Tawaif, which is sort of completely incorrect. And there were many Tawaifs, specifically Mahalaka Bai Chanda, who recently a lot of people have worked on her, and many others who were known for their writing as well. So that sort of distinction between writing and between performance seems a little sort of unfounded. And another thing that seems to be coming from, say, a modern sensibility, sort of Western British ideas about morality and so on, is, and generally say Orientalism, is how most men of most Indian, or Indian in the sense, ki most say native men are shown as effeminate or weak, and not able to stand up, being a little submissive and so on, and not just the sort of the feminine character of Ustad. Everyone else also, the Nawabs, Rajas, whoever's there, and this sort of Tajdar also ultimately gives up on protecting whoever he loved to for the cause of the nation only, but still, in the sense that they're not upstanding masculine men in that sense, which is also an idea. And therefore, in that imagery, you could contrast the Tawaifs who stood up, who fought, who were getting beaten, and so on and so forth. So that also comes from this colonial idea of native men being effeminate, and some women who fought in the revolt being more masculine. And we hear that imagery for a lot of Begums, from Begum Hazrat Mahal for Rani Lakshmi Bai, that they were more masculine, or they were more mardani than their husbands and counterparts. So we also see some sort of reflection of those ideas, even if it's unconscious, even if it's a narrative strategy to, present courtesans as these larger than life figures. That is there, and ultimately, I'll come to the point that is a key for me, is that. So we see throughout the series that the wives are fighting between each other. There are property disputes. They have their own sort of selfish reasons of whether they want to be good to a British or they don't want to be, and so on. And suddenly then there is this cause of national freedom, and everyone's united and everyone's fighting. And that's historically incorrect. If you see the history of Lahore particularly, and already around that time, we had discussions about prohibiting Nautch, anti-Nautch movement and all of that. And people were very vocal about restricting the area and restricting the sort of movement, mobility and so on. And Tawaifs were actively talking about that. They were opposing it. There is this particular Tawaif who established this Tawaif Sabha, where people would meet to just talk about these changing laws and so on. So it's not, and even before, so even if you think about pre-colonial times, Tawaifs were already involved in the politics of the region. So it's not that they suddenly came to this like consciousness that, oh, we have to fight for national freedom, for freedom of our country and so on. And that, I feel, is a very sort of common trope in most of history writing about Tawaifs, but also about women in general, that they were not otherwise part of history of politics, but then something happened, some major event happens, their husband dies or they are dethroned and their son is very young. So it's an extraordinary condition wherein women stand up and become political, and they're also sacrificial and selfless. So they're not fighting for themselves per se, they're fighting for the nation, right? So that kind of idea is found here as well, and which I think is problematic, because what it ultimately does is that the wives were cruel and rude and so sexual and promiscuous, and they had no morality and all of that. But let's put a redeeming quality that they fought for freedom. So it doesn't let you actually move beyond the moral sort of high grounding or the binaries that you make between good women, bad women. And it's just that, okay, they were bad, but they did this, so that let's celebrate. And my question would be that if we could actually look at Tawaifs as celebratory figures, or figures that we could talk about without having to, whitewash them or sanitize their lifestyles, and present them as this really selfless and brave, heroic figures, right? And this sort of also opens up a lot of questions about Tawaifs or courtesan culture in general. One of the first things is the etymology of Tawaif itself. Tawaif as a term comes from Arabic sources, where it has multiple set of root words which are generally related to sort of and give an idea of being a group or some kind of mobility, movement, and so on. and it particularly found popularity in North India, in Awadh, during the sort of early late 18th century, which is to say, not even in Delhi so much, right? In Awadh particularly, and uh, it did not mean that there was a shift in there was a new sort of group of performers that emerged, but largely that what were the practices or the cultural sort of associations associated to performing practices were getting very assimilated into Awadhi political culture. So there exists, even in Awadh, there existed various groups and various divisions and hierarchies between performing communities, which were based on class, caste, which were based on your area of operation, your mode of operation, the kind of skill that you had, the kind of training that you had, and so on. So these existed regardless of the sort of bracket name that we give them to. And what this why is this important is that it allows us to see that the Tawaif in itself is not a homogenic or a unified term. It emerged in a certain political, religious, cultural scenario, and it must be placed within that, right? And this also answers to a lot of sort of discussions about how uh, courtesan culture in North India is largely associated to Muslim women and to Muslim culture, and this is a practice that didn't exist in India before that, and so on. And this is important. This discussion is important. This understanding of where does the term emerge is important to understand that that's not true, right? Even when Tawaifs in Awadh was largely associated to a very Islamic lifestyle and culture and practices, they were not always Muslims. So there is this nexus between cultural practices, between the religion that the Nawabs of Awadh were following, which incorporated local practices, including Holi and celebrations of Diwali, Holi, and so on, and very like tiny local festivals as well, to their own cultural practices, where female performers became a very important part of that assimilation. So there were performers who would not perform during Muharram, who will give up their jewelry, who will give up their sort of instrument training. There were performers who commissioned imam baras. There were performers who sang songs of laments during Muharram and so on. So they incorporated the religious ritual practices of the rulers, and vis-a-vis the rulers also incorporated a lot of local practices, rituals, and so on. So it's important to look at the context of practices, which would hold true for Heeramandi, for Lahore as well. And the whole point being that Sikh culture doesn't get represented, that you can't just talk about Tawaifs as one group, right? Firstly, there were hierarchies, but also there were differences based on region, and that these differences would also be reflected in, like, as tiny things as their clothes, in their jewelry, in the language that they spoke, in the art form. For example, in Awadh, a lot of theatre developed around Wajid Ali Shah's time, who's the last Nawab. So that meant a change of form, that meant a change of how you dressed yourself, and so on. That should be reflected, that was reflected in Tawaif culture in different regions. And what this also allows us to explore is the history of migration of female performers. So there are several performers that migrated from Delhi to Awadh, or from Delhi to Lahore, or from later from Awadh to various other sort of new successor states like Rampur and Hyderabad. And they carried their own sort of cultural advancements, cultural habits with them, but they also incorporated newer sort of habits that they found in the regions of their migration. So it's very important to talk about context when we're talking about Tawaifs. And what it also allows, so I'll just give an example. There's this class of female performers called the Kanchanis, and you find Kanchanis mentioned in the N.A. Akbari. They were popular in the Mughal court. You also find some history of how they fell out of sort of favor, and they migrated to Awadh. Then from Awadh they migrated to as far as Hyderabad and so on. So that sort of history is important. So Kanchani as a term is not as popular as Tawaif, for example, but therefore it is important to sort of understand that Tawaif is a term that originated in a very specific context, and our discussion on the history of female performance shouldn't end on Tawaif only, and to move beyond that to look at other sort of specificities. And one is also able to then talk about the differences in caste, class, which become very important. As I talked about Kanchani, there are also others. There is this popular category of the Chune Wali, which has no hereditary history of performance. And Chune Wali translates to slaked lime seller, woman of the slake lime seller community, or things like that. So it also gives you an idea of the origin of female performers, and it tells you, okay, they weren't hereditary known to be performing, but they got into this. And then you can sort of explore further that where did this term first emerge and so on. And it's also a very caste based sort of denotation, because usually you will hear about Deredar Tawaifs, or you will hear about Khandani Tawaifs, which are a very elite class of performers. And one then doesn't talk about, so not Tawaifs were really popular, they were elite, they had a lot of power, but they were also just one section of the population of performers, right? So there were a lot of various sections, there were various hierarchies, there were discrimination, and life was not as rosy as we imagine for performers, for everyone across sort of the hierarchies. So that becomes important to talk about. And what this also allows to sort of understand is that there were often, these identities were also not fixed. In terms of migration, a lot of groups could also migrate and reinvent themselves. They could get newer identities. For example, there's a category called the Ramjani, which profess, so Ramjani as a term is Ram and Jani, which is born of Ram. So it gives you a very Hindu religious sort of identity. But with our sort of history about, say, the context, it's also born of Ram, is also something that is very, that seems to be very politically charged, or in the sense that it is giving you a statement that, you know, we're born of Ram. Of course, I mean, you can't trace that history and all of that, but it is a performance of an identity. It is a statement that, okay, this is my identity, this is what marks me. And so Sabha Diwan wrote this book called Tawaif Nama, where she talks about, and even Amritlal Nagar, who wrote in 1957, they talk about how Ramjani within the Tawaif community is understood as a euphemism for women born out of wedlock from women of the Nat and Bedia communities. So those women acquired the title of Ramjani and presented themselves as these modified, reinvented class of performers. So even the terms, the local sort of language that you see, you can see that there is a lot of flexibility, there is a lot of contestation, there is reinvention of your identity and so on. And you also reskill yourself. So a lot of, as I said earlier, that in Awadh, they developed a very sort of distinct culture of theatre, of performance of the Rahas, which is Krishna Leela in that sense, which Wajid Ali Shah wrote about, performed, acted, and so on. And so women trained for that. Women trained accordingly. The way of writing changed. The way of performing changed. and language change. Vidya Rao is also another scholar who works on this, who talks about how women adapted to the requirements of the time, right? So it was also flexible. It wasn't that okay, there was this pre-colonial period that the Tawaif culture was in rise, then the colonial came, and then everything went downhill. It wasn't like that. Even in the pre-colonial period, there were uphills and downhills, and there were constant negotiations, which is also visible in, say, the in later period when gramophone sort of was gramophone company was established in India, when Parsi theaters particularly started to gain popularity later, with the Bombay cinema as well. Women adapted to those changes. There is this scholar called Amlan Dasgupta. He writes about how women who were already entertainers, whose art was already in the public, were more open to recording their voices for the gramophone company than men who were singers and instrumentalists and so on. So it also gives you an idea about how women were more open, Tawaif were more open to change, because already their art was a source of income generation, and they were more free to adapt to changes, right? So they were free to perform, uh, they were free to record their voices, which is very sort of contrasting to what Heeramandi shows. And perhaps that's also true. Perhaps there were sort of all kinds of opinions, but there is also a possibility to see that possibility for change to be sort of viewed in that sense, and which is also how one could imagine that the expectation that when you're talking about Heeramandi, you could talk about Sikh cultural influence, or when you're talking about Awadh, you could talk about Islamic influence, because these were means through which Tawaifs could gain better access to, gain better financial access, gain better status, and so on. And but this, having said that, it does not mean that it was all agential and it was all freedom and autonomy, which was the first sort of post-independence sort of writing on Tawaifs, that they were free. They created this whole sort of structure which reversed patriarchy and so on. But that's not what the point is. The point is that that the Tawaif culture must be located in the regional local specificities, and B, that it is through those negotiations, that through that adapting, that changing, migration, and all of that, and structures of patronage that change across times. It's also very politically located. Sorry. It's also very politically located practice, right? So all of that needs to be looked at, and through that, what were the ways in which Tawaifs could hold power, right? What were the ways through which Tawaifs could be so important and be so significant that they are assumed to be the actual rulers? And so that history can only be sort of gauged when you look at the local regional context, and that is where their agency can also be placed. But one must remember that the logic of performance remains that of male desire, remains very sort of rooted to structures of patronage, and that sort of determined the way in which courtesan culture developed in various sort of regions. We tend to mystify and romanticize the pre-colonial period as, okay, everything was great, there was no discrimination, these were women who were really celebrated, and so on. And then, after colonial sensibilities and ideas of modernity, morality, and so on, there was a fall, right? So the one of the first thing would be to see if you're able to look at Tawaif culture or female performing community not as a unit, as a whole, then you'd be able to see that the narrative was not so linear. It wasn't like that they were really popular and ultimately, there was this decline. There were various ways in which Tawaif women continued to function, to operate. They found newer avenues, they modified their art form, and so on. And the other thing is to also remember that there were prejudices against the Tawaifs even in pre-colonial times. For example, there's this scholar Shweta Sachdeva Jha who talks about the taskiras, which are published poems of women, of some of them also Tawaifs, and how most of the accounts or the bio notes of these Tawaifs didn't talk about them as great poets, but as good archers and good horse riders, which was sort of euphemism for their sexual prowess and coquetry and so on. So there did exist some sort of discrimination. There is also this scholar called Aslam Mahmood who writes about various phrases that were popular in Awadh to denote female performers, which ranged from them being women who earned, which was seen derogatively, to women who earned, say, 1 taka for whatever time they gave, or women who were sexually promiscuous, and so on. So there did exist these prejudices and differences. What one can argue is that with the uh, sort of infiltration of a different class of people, questions about race, and questions about how uh, uh, India was seen as this less developed sort of nation, which was grounded on the conditions of women and so on. These ideas uh, established a more sort of a more critical environment for discussions about women's sexuality, and the marking of the space of the wife and the space of the non-wife, or the devdasi or the tawaif and so on. And but it isn't to say that it only happened with the coming of the British. And the other thing that I think I've stressed so many times is that when we think about Tawaifs, we think about this very elite group of people. Or, for example, when we think about Devdasis, we only think about temple dancers. And there were in existence various forms of performances. In terms of Devdasis, also there's scholars who talk about how they were Rajdasis, they were Alankar Dasis. Even in Devdasis, there were various different forms of practices. There were Jogatis who were Dalit sort of Devdasis. So that sort of idea gives you a very alternate reading of the popular understanding of upper class Devdasi practices that we think about. And there were also Mahari Devdasis who were from Odisha, and they married mortal men. They married men, but they were also Devdasis. So there exist various differences. Same for, say, Tawaifs also. And so, for example, if I'll give you an idea, there's Samuel Byrne. There's a photographer who is said to have photographed Tawaifs from Kashmir. And he writes in his sort of account that I was really confused that why were these women so shy? Why did they not want to be photographed? They are public women, right? And that is the point is that even though these women were performing, they didn't consider themselves to be public in the way we think of them. There were various categories. There were women who only performed in front of women. There were women who performed in male spaces. So that sort of difference, that sort of uh, uh, eye to the minute sort of details is what we need to sort of stress on. And the whole idea about public and private gets disrupted if you are able to look at it like that. And I think I'll end at that, if that's okay. I've taken too much time.
No, it's perfectly all right, and it is really insightful actually. So because like we have certain view, certain image of Tawaifs or courtesans, and especially after Heeramandi, the image about Tawaifs has been like rigidified actually. We have kind of like, okay, what they have shown in the series, that is Tawaif culture. But
Yeah.
only when you start to talk, we kind of understood how diverse it is actually. It's like
Yeah.
how heterogeneous the culture was actually. Different regions, it varied according to the time, it varied according to the places.
Yeah.
So we understood how complex the culture is actually. So how complex culture was. So really, thank you for your insights, for sharing your views as well as introducing us to this very complex area of research. Actually, thank you so much, Tanya. So I think we will begin the a discussion, a short discussion. So the first question will be like, um, what made you interested in Tawaifs? What led you to read and then like start researching about Tawaif actually? So and then like what is your research journey now? How is it going?
Okay. I was very interested in the whole national colonial history bit, where you talk about laws, where you talk about the various set of bills that were passed and the criticism by the Indian intellectual middle class men and so on. Of course, there are these very popular articles on sati and on widow remarriage and so on. And that was something that I don't know why I got interested into that, but I did. It was very interesting. It was also not very sort of different from my life in the sense that I was a Kathak student, and I heard this a lot that अच्छा Kathak सीख रही है, like I okay, you're teaching her Kathak, you're letting that happen, and that sort of idea, and I eventually left it also. So it always stayed with me कि okay, there was something wrong here, or there was something that people thought was wrong here. And of course, later, then when I read about all of these movements about the reform of dance itself into these very sort of sanitized forms and so on. So it got me really interested. I started my first set of entry was into laws. I looked at laws. I was a political science student. I looked at the legal debates on sexuality, on on what is this sort of general idea of a good woman or a good wife and so on. And there's abundance of literature on that. And of course, I was interested in Kathak, so I also sort of looked at courtesanery and a lot of laws on courtesanery. And very interestingly, uh, um, laws about criminal tribes also impacted courtesans because the idea was they inhabited with these tribes. They lived in the close quarters, so they were also, prone to similar sort of behaviors and so on. So then, of course, there's so many laws about anti-North and so on. That was my entry point. In my sort of area of research, there's a sort of remarkable event of 1857 of the revolt, and suddenly you see everything changes. There's so much literature on it. Of course, courtesans participated in it. There were a lot of writings about it. Not lot of, I mean, some writings about that. And Lata Singh has this sort of seminal paper, and you're like, okay, now that's like really interested in why is that not sort of talked about so much. And then you also sort of hear the aftermath of that is the Cantonment Act, the Contagious Disease Act, which actually what it does is that it limits um, all performing classes into this unified sort of category of the prostitute, which allows colonial authorities to make laws. And so there's a complete dismantling of all hierarchies, all structure, or differences of class and caste, to this one idea that all women who were to be found in public, who were anyway found to be not respectable, were essentially prostitutes, right? So that is where I that is what I found really interesting. And now my sort of topic completely changed. As you said, I am working on Hazrat Mahal, and Hazrat Mahal, interestingly, is also said to be a courtesan. And if not a courtesan, then she was at least like in some capacity sold to the royal house. She became a pari, which is a performer in that sense, but also sort of sexually available to the Nawab. There's this whole institute that trained these women and so on. So Hazrat Mahal, I found Hazrat Mahal very interesting because here is this woman who is said to have been of less respectable origins, who ends up becoming this celebratory wife and queen mother. And we talk about her, and she's so popular, and she's praised for her participation in the revolt and so on. And just by some sort of uh, uh, I also like reading in Hindi, so I read a lot of Hindi literature. I had already been reading that just for fun, and I found that what is written in English and what is written in popular writing was very different from what was being written in Hindi. And just like preliminary reading would tell me ki, oh, this person doesn't talk about that thing, why is that? And so just my idea remains the same. I continue to look at how women were talked about, how women who cannot be established as wives or respectable sort of women are talked about in history. And that's how I think with Kathak, with no one ever really said what the issue was, right? But it always stayed with me ki there's some problem with me doing Kathak, and we were also taught Bharatnatyam in school. And I remember this. This is a very personal anecdote. And so my Bharatnatyam teacher found out that I was also learning Kathak. She knew my Kathak teacher, and she just looked at me and she was like, "Why?" Like, and as if like she was ashamed, or she was like she was judging me. And that sort of remained, like, as a child I didn't think much of it, but later when I also read about all of that, I was like, okay, that makes sense, and it also tells me that those sort of ideas still exist in our way of life, in our thinking, in our present discourses. So yeah, I think that's what interested me.
Thank you, Tanya. I mean, hearing uh, so much of history is compressed within just 20 to 30 minutes. Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing your research journey too. It's fascinating to hear about it. My question, before going to my question, I also have to mention that, in one of the papers that I'm writing, one of the reformers, they were complaining that Devadasis do not distinguish about caste and class. They mingle with everyone. So yeah, there is something to think about that also. In the cross-cultural sentiment, how women are viewed, and how women who do not distinguish between castes are viewed in a certain sense. So it's an interesting thought. So my question is regarding the power or influence they hold over society. So in Heeramandi, we get references that one of the courtesans claim that we are the actual queens of law. And in Hyderabad, I've lived in Hyderabad, and in Hyderabad, we can see a lot of places named after Tawaifs, like Taramati Baradari, Prema Mati Mosque, or something like that. And then there is a Malaka Chandabai, who constructed dargahs in Secunderabad. So they have had quite an influence, and we also hear of more land holdings by Tawaifs also. So, my question is, how influential were they actually? Do they actually have? And it also ties to the agency question that you were speaking about earlier also. So, yeah.
So answer would be that they were very influential. They were absolutely uh, uh, great power holders. They were financially very sort of sound, and they commissioned a lot of schools, localities, shrines. So they were also culturally very significant. They were a bordered land, so they were also generating revenue from that. They were self-sufficient. They had their own sort of living establishments. They employed tutors and a variety of sort of associates to help and so on. So they were absolutely very, very significant in terms of holding political power, holding indirect political power, and also financially backing people who would be either related to them or their patrons, or they find these. So they had all of these associations with various courtiers, their patrons. So they were behind the curtains in that sense. They were not publicly holding offices, but they had a lot of indirect power, and which also came from their sort of very intimate and close association with the ruling elite. These were women uh, who accompanied men to wars, to leisure activities like hunting. They accompanied them to public events, so they were there. They were present in all of those sort of public discussions, in talks about politics and so on. And they were also financially very sound. They were being given a lot of gifts. They were being given a lot of land, which they sort of survived on. So it's uh, not untrue what Heeramandi presents, that they were really, really powerful. They had a lot of jewelry and all of that. But having said that, what we also need to remember is that these were just a class of elite performers. There were also female performers who were not that elite, who were not that powerful. And so usually when we think of the Tawaifs, we think of groups of really, really elite women. And they were not necessarily, women were working without groups also. Women were working individually. They were migrating and establishing themselves in newer sort of spaces. And they were coming from completely non-Tawaif backgrounds as well. That held some currency. Not having a Tawaif background held currency. And so for a woman who wasn't from that background, it was difficult to establish herself. So the idea is that yes, they're really powerful, but that power was only for a section of the population, and not. It is not to say that that is how it always remained. That was also not fixed. Women could acquire a lot of power. They could become really popular. They could employ ideas, and they could perform a particular identity. So there is Kurutaleen Heather writes the Street Singers of Lucknow. This is a short story. It's a take on how men reinvented women as these great singers trained under so and so prestigious sort of musicians, but they were actually nothing. Like they emerged from nowhere, and that so there's this whole sort of structure and language of performing a certain identity that was also established. So yeah, that
Yeah, thanks for the answer, Tanya. So, when we watched Heeramandi, or whenever we listen stories about Tawaif, immediately we all connected with Devadasi tradition in South India. So it's a question, a kind of we would like to compare it and ask this question. So in Madras Presidency during the colonial era, there were movements led by women within the Devadasi community, like Moolu Ramamridam Ammayar or Muthulakshmi Reddy. So they are from the Devadas, they were from the Devadasi community, and then they led movements against the sexual exploitation of women, Devadasis, and then they were asking to abolish the system itself, the tradition itself. So, and interestingly, like Moolu Ramamridamammayar, she's also a novelist. She's also one of the first women novelists. And then she kind of like exposed how oppressive the system was, how oppressive the system was, how women were sexually exploited within the Devadasi system. To expose that, she even written novels actually. So as a critique towards the practice. So we wanted to know, so how during this colonial era as well as in the modern era, how the Tawaifs viewed themselves, and were there any movements within the Devadas, within the Tawaif courtesan community against the culture, against the Tawaif culture and Tawaif practice? So how would you like? This is the question we have.
I am not aware of any sort of evidence that there were women from the Tawaif communities who were opposing the practice. Uh, Unfortunately, not a lot of sort of biographical or autobiographical evidences remain. Recently, some people are looking at women's writings, their poetry, and so on, as sort of means through which one could understand their location and so on, but not so much autobiographical in that sense. What uh, what I can say is that one finds that largely the criticism to the Tawaifs come from colonial authority. but that's also really complex. So we can talk about that if we have to. And from sort of nationalist, not even say nationalist, say early middle class, educated, early nationalist sort of class of people. And I think the major point here is that, at least in North India, I'm sorry if there's a lot of noise. Uh, uh, in North India, after 1857, there were a lot of structural changes in how the colonial authorities ruled the region, and there were stricter sort of restrictions on mobility, on distancing from sort of distancing the British from the native population. And already the Tawaif culture was changing in terms of how it was practiced, especially with it in 1856. The Awadh was annexed, the Nawab was sent to Calcutta. A lot of performers went with him. Others who stayed here looked for patrons in less sort of noble or royal elite, so they moved to rural areas, they moved to other princely states, and so on. And ultimately, with the establishment of a British cantonment, after sort of restriction, uh, a large scale sort of restriction of the cantonment as a very white town, it also restricted the mobility of women performers. And a lot of scholars talked about how many Tawaifs of sort of lesser hierarchical status found employment within the cantonment. So there were a lot of changes that were already taking place, say, since the 1830s or 40s. And uh, one does not find a particular moment when it was assumed, okay, now this is wrong and this should be abolished, and so on. Women were, so a lot of writings that are available are unfortunately not from women. We have, say, Ruzwa writing Umraujan Ada, and so on. It is a perspective, a woman's perspective, but from a male author's viewpoint. And it's also post 1857, so it's carrying those ideas itself. So Umrao Jan Ada is said to, talk about how she herself feels that she is less respectable, and a married life would be better than this, and so on. But one can also say that these are reflections of the ideas that were becoming popular and may not actually be reflective of the Tawaif's consciousness, and so on. Yeah, and thanks.
So the next question is almost like related to this one. So I mean, when you watch this Heeramandi series, it's happening in the colonial setting. It's happening in the, I mean, in the 20th century, maybe like early 20th century, mid 20th century. So it's the colonial setting, and there is a kind of like within the series itself, there is a portrayal of nationalist movement. So how the Tawaifs, they end up being part of the nationalist movement. There's a portrayal towards it. So we just like get curious. How did the colonial state viewed Tawaif culture, and how does the mainstream nationalist movement viewed the Tawaif culture? Because in the pre-modern era, it was the nobles, it was the king, it was the state which gave a lot of patronage to the Tawaif, to the courtesans. So when the power changed, when the administration changed, so what happened to the Tawaif system? How the new state, the colonial state, viewed at them? So because you were interested in laws, colonial laws, so how, what kind of laws were formulated, how they looked at to it. So that is one part of the question, and the other part is how the nationalist movement viewed it, especially Gandhi or the mainstream nationalist movement at that time. So how did they view it, and how it get reflected in the post-colonial India actually? So this kind of formulation, how it if impacted the Tawaif culture in the post-colonial India. Yeah.
So, colonial sort of understanding and response to Tawaif culture was is also like, it's a long durée sort of interaction, So early colonial officials were also sort of criticized as being nabobs and white Mughals and so on, because they adopted the sort of cultural practices that they witnessed here. They were equally part of, patronizing uh, giving patronage to Tawaifs. They held their own dancing troupes and so on. They married Indian women, all of that. So that is how they established their own sort of court, if one can say that, in India. And they didn't view Tawaifs culture as critically as in the later sort of part of their rule here. Um then a lot of changes impacted that sort of change. Of course, these sort of these colonial officials, when they went back to Britain, they were criticized for their way of life. There was a rise of Victorian morality and Christian sort of ideals. So there was a lot of criticism of how the British were conducting themselves here. There was also the question of mixed race children, which problematized the whole sort of basis on which the British authorities were ruling in India, that they were racially superior. And here there were a class of, Anglo-Indian who were as human and as, capable of ruling themselves as the white and so on. The other thing was, so there are also like a lot of practical things. There was the opening of the Suez Canal, which allowed women easy access to the South Asian sort of region. So there was no longer a need of native women and so on. There was also 1857, particularly in North India, that had a major impact on how British viewed Tawaifs, because, as you said, the Tawaifs were so closely associated to royal sort of patronage networks that they were automatically understood to be involved in anti-colonial struggle, even when they weren't, and a lot of them were actively involved or indirectly involved. They financed it and so on. So they faced a lot of uh, uh, colonial sort of anger in the aftermath of 1857. Their lands or properties were confiscated, and so there were a lot of rules also. Even when I was saying that, a lot of them were poets, so there were also the vernacular press acts, and the press acts after immediately following 1857 that restricted a lot of content that was being published. And there were the Cantonment Act, the Contagious Disease Acts that came after in 1860s and so on, that severely restricted Tawaif cultural practices. And so Veena Oldenburg is one of the first studies in post-independence area in 1980s, where she talks about, where she interviews all of these Tawaifs, some of them who were present in sort of that time. And they talk about how there was this uh, change in their performance practices, also in the nature of what was being demanded from them, what were they required to do, and so on. So, and specifically, so all of these changes, all of these very practical political changes, changed the way in which Tawaifs were viewed. And if you look at scholars who work on British women's sort of writings and accounts, you will also find a very interesting point that they say that, oh, Tawaifs are actually really the only women who are actually really free. They could do whatever they wanted to do. They were not dependent on anyone, and so on. So there are various sort of views that one can find about the Tawaif culture, and despite the ban and so on, up until the 1930s, in fact, immediately after 1857 also, the Tawaif performances were a part of British life here in India. Actually, I think that it would be more true to say that it were the middle class educated elite who opposed the culture more than the British. Of course, the British didn't differentiate, they didn't acknowledge that there were hierarchies, they didn't really appreciate the art form and so on. And it worked for them because native women could easily be termed as prostitutes and, then uh, kept in the cantonments, regularly sort of checked medically and all of that. So it was considered as this necessary evil in that form way. And that accessibility of native men to white men is what one can say is actually what sparked all of these anti-Nach movements, because there were already all of these ideas about Indian nationalism, about Indian womanhood being this very pious and pure sort of identity, which the existence of the Tawaifs and all the other sort of hierarchies that were continuously emerging were sort of problematizing. So it is the early nationalist sort of criticism of the Tawaifs that takes precedence here. And there were Lahore specifically had a lot of it was also a political center of anti-colonial struggles, and anti-Nach struggles also emerged from there. Even in Lucknow, Arya Samaj was one of these reformist movements who were extremely opposed to the Tawaif culture, and there were sort of arguments about how this would restore society, how this is what has corrupted Indian civilization. A lot of the blame was put on Muslim rulers and so on. And so a lot of literary writing that emerged at the time, you also see that there are these women who are reformed. So they are living a better life. So there are all of these ashrams and hospice type places that would take older females on the sort of account that they no longer associate with their practice and so on. In the post-colonial, and I think that is how it remained for a very long time. So, for example, when we talked about the freedom struggle, the wives don't find so much mention. Most of the nationalist and early post-colonial writings do not mention the wives as important participants of the revolt, even if they were not sort of sacrificial, even if they were not soldiers, right? Even if they were just indirectly involved, that doesn't find so much mention. Some work has been done on Gandhi's interaction with courtesans, and that's also very interesting because so the Tawaifs, so Tawaifs also modified themselves. A lot of later, sort of with the coming of the gramophone industry and so on, a lot of women of the Tawaif families distanced themselves from their dancing set of origins and called themselves Gaikas or Ganewali. And so you see a lot of Ganewali sung, Gaika sung emerging during the time and around sort of the anti-colonial struggle as well. And these were active participants and supporters of anti-colonial movement. They donated their money. Gohar Jan is this very famous sort of singer from the Tawaif background. She is said to have donated money to Gandhi's movement. But Gandhi had the opinion that he didn't mind them participating, but he didn't approve of their means of livelihood, so he couldn't support their participation. And also Gandhi's movement was followed by a lot of middle class families. Middle class women came to the street, and there are evidences which suggest that these women and their male counterparts, opposed to the courtesans' presence in the movement. So, uh, and that is why I think Heeramandi needs to be sort of looked at critically also, because it tells you that, women participated, courtesans participated in the revolt, but it doesn't tell you that there were so many complexities that, that they just didn't fight as soldiers. They were also fighting indirectly. They were donating money, they were financing, they were, of course, the tropes about hiding rebels and so on exist. But still, like, it needs to be complicated more than that. And the other bit is also that they were also criticized for their participation or their way of life. So, in the post-colonial times, it's only recently, I think, that actually since 2007, which is the sequicentenary of the 1857 revolt, that there is some work being done on Tawaif's participation in revolt of 1857 and in the freedom struggle that ensued later.
Great. Thank you, Tanya. I think we've reached the conclusion, and let me conclude here. And thanks so much for coming today and illuminating us with I mean, quite a grander history within a short span of time. I mean, we've definitely learned a lot today. And most importantly, what I learned is that I mean, we need to historicize how certain conceptions arise about a particular form of performance, a particular form of dance, music, and so on and so forth, particular form of living. More importantly, uh, we understand how morality is being constructed around these women as centers, and how each women are differentiated comparing these women, how their livelihood shifted, and how they are complicated in their own ways, because they vary according to each locality. There are a lot of hierarchies within them, and we only know about a few popular women in that particular sense, few elite women. We also need to look at all these other histories also, and you've certainly complicated the more popular understanding of the subject, and you've certainly illuminated with us the knowledge. And thanks for it again. And for our viewers and listeners, thank you all. And we'll meet you back either with Pagir History, where we interview for 3 hours, or Pagir Introductions, where we interact with our guest for 1 hour. And I hope that Tanya will give us her book, and then we'll interview her for 3 hours again. So we are very happy to have you again at the show. And do follow us on YouTube, Spotify, and Instagram to get updates on our activities. Thank you all. Ciao.
Thank you.